I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
Welcome back, everyone. It's the President's Guy. I'm going to be doing a reaction video today. I was planning to have some original content out, but I just got back from vacation, so for the last week I haven't been super productive in terms of editing and things like that. So I thought I would kind of do a reaction to a video that I've kind of had on the background of my thought for a while. I have seen it before. It's from the YouTube channel of Dr. Mike, who's a fantastic YouTuber. He's a family medicine doctor, and he did a video about the deaths of all the presidents. Before we get into it, some of their deaths are speculative, to so to speak, more of an educated guess because it's been so long and the doctoring at the time wasn't super advanced. But it's kind of an interesting look at how all the presidents died, and you'll see a shocking number of them just happened to die because whatever illness affected them happened before we had treatment for it. Aside from like JFK or Lincoln, most of the presidents who have been shot, who have been ill, we probably could have prolonged their life if they had just come around a few, years later. But let's get into this.
There have been 45 presidents in the history of the United States, and as of uploading this video, 39 of them have died. Today I'm talking about what...
And actually, since he's uploaded this, Jimmy Carter has passed away. And I actually think H.W. Bush passed away after this video came out.
Killed every president and the bizarre circumstances that surrounded many of their deaths. 4 assassinations.
Oh, I think I have I have the captions on.
A top secret surgery aboard a fishing boat. God bless America, and pee-woo. George Washington was killed by his doctors. That's what I think anyway. In 1799, then retired President Washington developed a sore throat. His condition worsened over the next few days, despite the efforts of several physicians. Of course, in 1799, medical treatment was very poor, as doctors often believed the best way to treat ailments was by balancing the humors, meaning they would balance the amount of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile within the body.
That makes no sense!
Over the course of several days, doctors drained Washington of 32 ounces of his blood.
There's an episode of Pawn Stars where they actually show one of the bleeding devices, not an exact one, but the same kind that they would have used on Washington, and it basically looks like a little cube with blades on it, and they just bleed you, basically, because they thought that was the answer. And just absolutely terrible, because Washington didn't even necessarily want to be president. He just accepted the position because he knew he had to, and it was what was best for the country. And he leaves the presidency in 1797, and all he wants to do is go to Mount Vernon and spend the rest of his years. And 2 years later, he comes down with an illness and dies.
Gave him blisters in his throat, forced him to vomit, and filled him with enemas. No surprise, Washington passed after several days of this medieval torture. I do wonder if Washington would have lived longer had he just hydrated well and maybe got a Z-Pack. John Adams lived until 90 years old, the longest living president until Ronald Reagan, when he died of heart failure, likely related to arterial sclerosis, a blockage of your arteries due to plaque buildup, usually occurring with old age or poor lifestyle habits.
And it is just insane how long Adams, and he'll talk about Jefferson, how so many of our early presidents in an era where the life expectancy is like in your 40s, they live to be into their 80s. I mean, it's insane.
Strangely enough, Adams died on July 4th, 1826. Exactly 50 years to the day he signed the Declaration of Independence, and just 5 hours after Thomas Jefferson, who died the same exact day.
And if you ever watch the miniseries Adams, about John Adams, they show the scene where they both die, and Adams' last words, not knowing that Jefferson was already dead, said something to the effect of "Jefferson lives" or "Jefferson survives," and not knowing, because they sort of rekindled their relationship by this point after feuding publicly for years, and he thought Jefferson had outlived him, but in fact he had already passed.
The cause of his death is not conclusive, but it was likely due to a variety of ailments such as diarrhea, kidney damage, and an enlarged, possibly cancerous prostate. America's shortest president at just 5'4", James Madison lived until the age of 85 when he died of congestive heart failure, where the heart's ability to pump blood deteriorates, causing fluid buildup throughout the body. While specific details are not well recorded, James Monroe died in 1831 after a battle with tuberculosis, a bacterial infection that usually attacks the lungs. And while he may have been only America's 5th president, at the time of his death, he joined Adams and Jefferson to become the 3rd president to die on July 4th. The fact
That was not lost on the public either.
of former presidents dying on July 4th was not lost on the American people,
Ah,
with the
there
trend
you go.
becoming a bit of a mid-1800s meme. John Quincy Adams served 1 term as president and then became the first to die in office, though not in office as president. You see, after losing the election of 1829, John Quincy Adams continued his public service by holding Congress for 9 terms. At the age of 78,
Yeah, he did 17 years in Congress, and he ends up doing a very impassioned speech on the floor for hours, and he ends up basically falling out. And I think they carried him either to the Senate chambers or across the street where he died.
during a contentious debate over the Mexican-American War on the floor of the House of Representatives, Adams collapsed, suffering a significant stroke, where there's decreased circulation to the brain leading to neurological damage. He died at his home 2 days later, but not before what must have been a spectacular emergency on Capitol Hill.
And, you know, he's the only president to take a lower position after. You know, you don't see presidents go to being a governor or a senator or in Congress. You know, Taft ends up going to the Supreme Court, but you really don't see presidents really have a post-presidential job, and that's how much service to his country meant to John Quincy Adams. As much as his presidency probably didn't go all that well, phenomenal human being.
Andrew Jackson suffered a long and slow decline in health before dying at the age of 78. The cause of his death, though, has been widely disputed, some attributing it to the use of the medication calomel, leading to heavy metal poisoning. But JAMA states he probably died of kidney failure with full body swelling known at the time as dropsy. While it's not entirely certain what killed Martin Van Buren, many sources, including his obituary in the New York Times, cite issues originating within his chest. It's likely his decline began with a lung infection, leading to cardiopulmonary failure. Now, things get interesting. William Henry Harrison delivered a 2-hour inaugural address in freezing drizzle without a coat or gloves, which many people believe to be the cause of pneumonia, an infection of the lungs, which killed him only 1 month into serving office. In 1841, germs had not been discovered. Rather, doctors believed the most effective medical treatments were to, just like with Washington, balance the humors. Doctors blistered the president and made him drink substances that forced him to vomit and have diarrhea. Of course, none of those methods actually worked. Goop. And so, William Henry Harrison remains our president with the shortest stint in office.
And what likely killed him was the DC water supply. You don't get sick despite what your parents may have told you from playing in the rain and the cold. You're more susceptible to getting sick when you're cold because your immune system is in a somewhat weakened state, having to kind of overcompensate for that. But like many presidents around this time, likely just died of something else.
John Tyler took over for William Henry Harrison and served the remainder of that term as president. Historians
Terrible
claim
president.
he was never very healthy to begin with and died in 1862 of a stroke. He remains the only president in U.S. history not to be buried with the Stars and Stripes, as he was the darling of the Confederacy and was buried with their flag instead. James K.
Which wouldn't have been that flag. That's the naval jack. He would have been buried probably with the stars and bars, which is pretty much what the Georgia state flag looks like now. He never actually got to take his seat in the Confederate Congress, but he was elected to one.
Polk had grand visions of his life after the presidency, leaving Washington on the southern tour of the U.S., eventually hoping to end in Nashville, where he had purchased a large home. Unfortunately, Polk died 3 months after leaving office, the shortest post-presidency stint in American history, from cholera, a diarrheal disease caused by drinking contaminated water.
Again, another instance of the DC water supply just being bad, and he'll talk about this later, but it's probably also what killed Zachary Taylor.
Zachary Taylor served a year in office before dying under what many would say are suspicious circumstances. To this day, many claim he was poisoned by pro-slavery Southerners. The cause of his death was so controversial that in 1991, his descendants actually agreed to have his remains exhumed for testing, which did not find a high enough volume of arsenic inside his remains to suggest a definitive poisoning.
And I don't know how this ended up getting out, but you can actually Google, they have like a picture of his skull. Sort of morbid, but you can see the, picture of Zachary Taylor's skull. It's crazy that 140 years after he died, this was such a contentious debate that we literally dug the man up and tested his bones for arsenic poisoning.
More common theories, he contracted cholera or dysentery after celebrating the 4th of July in Washington, D.C., which at the time had primitive sewers, often resulting in food and water contamination.
And he had been eating like a bunch of ice cream and cherries and stuff, and that's what a lot of people contributed it to.
Millard Fillmore is rumored to have been the White House's first health-conscious president, avoiding alcohol and tobacco. He did die from a stroke at the age of 74. Franklin Pierce died at the age of 69 from cirrhosis of the liver, likely due to a lifetime of heavy drinking. Alcohol abuse damages the liver directly, as ethanol is a toxin, which leads to inflammation and massive swelling within the gut.
Polk was a pretty heavy drinker. He kind of overcame it at one point, but then it gets real bad when he's president, because on the way to his inauguration, there's a train accident involving him and his wife and one of his sons. I think his last living son to that point, which was very common in the 19th century. But his son's essentially decapitated in the accident. He sees this happen, and his wife is so traumatized by it. She blames him winning the presidency for it happening. And she basically leaves D.C. after that and isn't there for him during the term. And he just drinks himself stupid for the entirety of the term. And it's an understandable thing. Still a pretty bad president, but you can understand why someone would do that after that level of trauma.
Buchanan is considered by many to be the worst president in the history of the United States, as he did nothing to preserve the Union before handing a country divided by slavery to Abraham Lincoln.
You are useless.
Information on his death is far and few between, with most reports claiming he died at the age of 77 from pneumonia. Abraham Lincoln, gun. Next. Just kidding. Though the death of Abraham Lincoln is probably the most well-known on this list, it's not without its intrigue. Just 5 days after the Union victory of the Civil War, famous actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth snuck into Lincoln's box at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. and...
Slight correction. 5 days after the surrender at Appomattox. The war doesn't technically end until May because Johnston's army's still out there. There are armies out in Texas that have yet to surrender. But from a practical standpoint, the war was over.
Fired a .44 caliber single-shot Derringer pistol directly into the back of Lincoln's head from just inches away. Lincoln immediately fell into a coma and died across the street 7 hours later. This we know, but here are the juicy details that are often looked over. Heavily detailed notes on Lincoln's final hours and his following autopsy were taken by the president's personal physician, Dr. Robert Stone, which is how we know that Dr. Stone did nothing to help the situation by using his finger to probe the wound and search for the bullet, putting unnecessary pressure inside the president's brain at his most vulnerable time. Look, he was gonna die.
Actually, from what I understand, there was a moment where he pulled a big blood clot kind of out of the wound, and it probably relieved some pressure, and Lincoln appeared almost to slightly improve in that moment. He's right, and there was no way Lincoln was surviving that, but it's not like with Garfield where you're making the infection worse and it's a prolonged thing. You know, whatever he did in that moment probably caused more short-term relief for Lincoln than anything that would have hammered or hindered him.
Die no matter what they did, but a dirty, gloveless finger inside the brain probably didn't help. Andrew Johnson became the first president to go on and serve in the Senate after his presidency, and died of a stroke.
Okay, so minor correction to what I said earlier. He did go to be senator of Tennessee after leaving the presidency, so we did have one besides John Quincy Adams.
At the age of 66. Ulysses S. Grant was an avid cigar smoker, which was a likely cause of his throat cancer that killed him at the age of 63. It was this death that largely sparked Americans' fear of the disease, which we still see today. Rutherford B.
And it comes from, there's a famous picture of Grant, I think it's at Shiloh, or maybe it's Cold Harbor, either where he's leaned up against a pole, and he's got a cigar. And he was a smoker, but after this, he got mailed just hundreds and thousands of cigars from fans and citizens, and he really increased the smoking to where he's smoking 10 to 20 a day. Even towards the end, when he quits smoking, he's down to still about 5 a day. When he realizes he's got throat cancer, he immediately quits. And he spends the next, few months writing his memoirs so his family has some money when he passes away, and not even a week after he finishes them that he dies.
Hayes died at the age of 70 of complications after a heart attack. Assassination number 2. Only 18 months into his presidency, James A. Garfield was shot on a train platform in Baltimore, Maryland by
It wasn't 18 months, I don't believe. I think it was like 4.
Charles Julius Guiteau, a lawyer and author who was deeply disillusioned, believing he was instrumental to Garfield's election and therefore furious when he was not rewarded with his own political appointment. Guiteau was executed after being found guilty of murdering Garfield, but not before he argued that he didn't kill Garfield. Rather, Garfield's doctors were to blame. While Guiteau was no doubt responsible for pulling the trigger, firing a bullet into Garfield's back, the thing is, might be right.
What?
Reports indicate that the bullet created a 3.5-inch wound in Garfield's abdomen, with the bullet finally resting in a benign location between his groin and navel. It took 3 months for the infection to kill Garfield, but not before countless doctors used their fingers and tools to open the wound to 20 inches in width in an endless search for this bullet. It wasn't just the doctors either, as famed telephone inventor Alexander Graham Bell used the world's first metal detector to provide a general location of this bullet. Countless physicians have debated the exact cause of Garfield's death and will never be able to say for sure. But had doctors simply sewed Garfield up and allowed him to rest, he may not have died from this gunshot wound after all.
It was mostly one doctor, and it wasn't even Garfield's personal physician. His name was literally Doctor. His first name was Doctor. Crazy. But he wouldn't, when Alexander Graham Bell comes to use the metal detector, he's laying on a spring mattress with metal springs in it. But the doctor wouldn't even let him look at the side of the body where the bullet ended up being, which I think was on his left. He would only let him look at the right. He was so pushy in handling this, and Guiteau is probably right. And that's the big difference between cause of death and mode of death. The cause of death would be the gunshot. That sets the chain of events in motion. The mode of death, which is what actually killed him, would be the infection. So it sort of goes back to like people were talking about COVID numbers and all that, people dying of and with COVID. There is a difference. COVID could be your cause of death, and that's where people were counting causes of death. The mode of death could be heart disease as a complication or pneumonia as a complication from COVID. So cause versus mode of death. And this ends up happening with McKinley. When he gets shot, they remember what happened with Garfield, and they just sew him up and try to leave him alone. And at first, it looked like it was working.
Chester A. Arthur died 2 years after leaving office from a significant cerebral hemorrhage, thought to have been caused by his hypertension or high blood pressure. Grover Cleveland died of a heart attack at the age of 71, but that's far from the most interesting event in his medical history. In the summer of 1893, at the beginning of his second term in office, he felt a lump in the roof of his mouth. His doctor diagnosed it as cancer and recommended having it removed immediately. Cleveland feared news of him having cancer would shake the stock market and disrupt the nation, so he opted for a secret surgery aboard a yacht during a 4-day fishing trip.
This is a secret.
6 surgeons numbed the president up with ether, successfully removed the tumor, 5 teeth, and a large part of his upper left jawbone in just 90 minutes, swaying back and forth in the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. Because the surgery was inside the president's mouth and his signature mustache remained intact, Cleveland hid the surgery from the public. Despite whirling rumors, smear campaigns, and discrediting journalists, the operation remained unconfirmed for 24 years before one of the doctors broke their silence and finally told the truth.
I think he also wore a prosthetic piece in his mouth to hide it too.
Harrison was the grandson of President William Henry Harrison, and just like Grandpa, he died of pneumonia at the age of 68. Assassination number 3. 6 months into his second term in 1901, William McKinley was shot twice in the abdomen by Leon Frank.
Yeah, that's the hardest.
Shouldgosh.
It's Czolgosc.
Shoal.
And speaking, he's Mike is Russian, so you'd think he'd be able to pronounce like an Eastern European name.
Oh gosh.
By Leon Frank Shulgosh, making him the 3rd U.S. president to be assassinated in 36 years. Shulgosh lost his job during the economic panic of 1893 and became a believer in anarchism, or a terrorist movement sweeping across Europe that seek to assassinate world leaders.
And I don't think he talked about it with Guiteau, but Guiteau, like a lot of people at the time, wanted a patronage job, and he made a couple of speeches on behalf of Garfield during the campaign, so he kind of felt like he was owed a job. Very disillusioned man. Czolgosz just was, like he said, an anarchist.
Czolgosz approached McKinley in a crowded building at a festival in Buffalo, shook his hand.
And you would think by this point in time that we would have some fucking security for the president. And oddly enough, Robert Todd Lincoln was around for all three of these assassinations. He was Secretary of War for Garfield, and when McKinley gets shot in Buffalo, he's like 2 blocks over.
And fired 2 shots from a .32 revolver. One bullet bounced off a button and didn't harm McKinley, but the other penetrated his abdomen. McKinley was rushed to a nearby hospital where a surgeon sewed up the entry and exit wounds from the bullet in the president's stomach, though the bullet was never found. Doctors were optimistic for a healthy recovery in the following days, but a week or so later, they discovered his wounds had become gangrenous, where parts of the body begin to die and cause deeper infection. It was the death of William McKinley that ignited a national discussion about protecting the president, with Congress ultimately charging the Secret Service with that exact duty in 1906. Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep in 1919 when a blood clot entered his lung. Future Vice President Thomas R. Marshall famously said, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight." William Howard Taft was our...
Theodore Roosevelt was badass. He got shot and finished a speech. He built a boat by hand and it was stolen. He then built another boat by hand and tracked down the thieves and brought them to justice. You don't mess with the bull moose.
Our nation's heaviest president, at one point reaching 340 pounds, and died at the age of 72 after lingering in a coma caused by complications with high blood pressure, heart disease, and inflammation of the bladder. Time for my favorite one. While in office, Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke in 1919 that paralyzed his left side and nearly blinded him. Out of fear that the news would shake the country, Wilson and his inner circle kept the president's health a complete secret, hiding him away where he could only be seen by his personal physician and his wife, Edith Wilson, the star of this story. While it's never been conclusively proven, it is believed.
It's been pretty conclusively proven. Edith was running the country for like 2 years.
That instead of serving as the intermediary between her husband, the president, and the cabinet actually running the country, Edith took it upon herself to make countless executive decisions, effectively serving as America's first female president. Where's that movie? Woodrow Wilson survived the remainder of his term and died 3 years later of further complications from his stroke. Warren G. Harding died in office at the age of 57 from what is believed to have been a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. His cause of death is not entirely conclusive because his wife refused an autopsy. Calvin Coolidge died.
He had also been on a train ride not long before where I think he was eating some like poorly refrigerated seafood. And that probably didn't help anything either.
Died alone in his bedroom from coronary thrombosis, or a clot in the coronary artery blocking blood flow to the heart. Herbert Hoover lived 31 years after leaving the White House amidst the Great Depression. In 1962, Hoover was diagnosed with colon cancer and had a tumor removed from his large intestine. 2 years later, his intestines ruptured, causing massive bleeding, leading to a coma and his eventual death in 1964. Franklin Delano Roosevelt holds the record for most presidential terms, having won 4 elections in a row from 1932 until his death in office. In 1944, a team of physicians performed a full assessment of FDR and found he was suffering from numerous heart issues, high blood pressure, and bronchitis, likely all of these caused by a lifetime of smoking and heavy amounts of tobacco. Despite his declining health, he ran for a 4th presidential term, privately saying he would resign once World War II was over. The stress...
And it was pretty well understood that he wasn't going to live through this 4th term. Maybe even to the point where he could resign. So when they select the vice president, they're pretty much selecting the next president.
Eventually overwhelmed Roosevelt in April of 1945, resulting in a brain bleed while posing for a portrait.
That same portrait you see in the background, if you go to the little White House here in Georgia, where he dies, that portrait's still there. And around the sort of the outer portion of the portrait, it's not finished. I actually have that same one hanging up on the wall here.
Collapsed and died shortly thereafter. Harry Truman was hospitalized for 22 days at the age of 88 because of heart failure, heart arrhythmia, and kidney failure. He became comatose due to sepsis, the body's life-threatening response to an infection, and died the night after Christmas in 1972. At one point, Dwight D. Eisenhower smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day, which contributed to years of heart issues. He suffered several heart attacks and even survived numerous cardiac arrests.
it was kind of a running joke during his presidency about how sick he really was. He was always in the hospital, and people were always worried about it, but he persevered through all 8 years.
No surprise he died of heart failure in 1969. He did beat Hitler, though. John F. Kennedy may have had the most complex medical history out of any U.S. president. He is known to have had, or was speculated to have, the following conditions and diseases: scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, chickenpox, severe spastic colitis or IBS, Cushing's syndrome, urinary tract infections, prostatitis, Addison's disease, malaria, adrenal insufficiency, and chronic back pain, amongst others. Despite his countless health problems, his back issues were the one that played a role in his infamous assassination in Dallas in 1968. Specifically, the back brace that he wore because of failed back surgeries hidden underneath his suit, it actually prevented Kennedy from ducking after being hit with the first bullet. Who fired the bullet? Well, that's a video for a different channel. Lyndon
Lee Harvey Oswald.
B. Johnson was a hero of the Democratic Party for passing groundbreaking civil rights legislation in the 1960s. And he was also the hero of the Party for going hard with food, alcohol, and cigarettes. In a famous interview with Walter Cronkite, LBJ said smoking calmed him down, and it was better for his heart to smoke and be relaxed than not smoke and be nervous. An interesting hypothesis that probably contributed to the heart attack that killed him in his Texas ranch in 1973.
It was like a couple weeks after that interview, which if he had run for that final term in 68, he would have left in the beginning of 73. Who knows if the stress of the presidency would have killed him during that term, because he barely survives the term of 72, and he dies not long after. So it's very probable that he could have died of a heart attack or a stroke while he was in office.
Richard Nixon was 81 years old when a blood clot in his left atrium became dislodged and traveled to his brain, causing a stroke. He quickly fell into a coma and died 4 days later. Gerald Ford died in 2006 with a death certificate that cites arteriosclerotic cerebral vascular disease and diffuse arterial sclerosis, or thickening of arterial walls causing poor circulation, leading to organ damage.
Which isn't surprising. You see that kind of thing in athletic people a lot. And he was a star football player in his college days.
Reagan spent the final 10 or so years of his life in a losing battle with Alzheimer's disease, where brain cells and connections die slowly, causing loss of memory and other issues.
After I think 92 or 3, he kind of goes into a reclusive state, and no one really hears or sees from him from about a decade, other than, kind of in and out of his foundation office, aside from his wife, and he died in like 2004.
Eventually died in 2004 from pneumonia. And finally, our most recent, George H.W. Bush, who in 2012 was diagnosed with
Hello.
Can you come help?
All right.
Please come help.
Parkinsonism, or a type of deterioration of brain tissue from blocked small blood vessels affecting motor function, necessitating the use of a mobility scooter and limiting his speech. The condition slowly worsened into his 90s, and he died on November 30th, 2018.
And of course, Carter died last year while dealing with cancer at age 100. Not a bad video. Pretty good, interesting way to look at the kind of the evolution of health science and the way we take care of our presidents. Let me know what you thought about that one, guys. Keep a lookout for the next original content. Like, share, and subscribe. And remember, never stop learning.